Kia ora, I'm Catriona MacLennan. Welcome to the 2014 series of Womenpower. We'll be focusing on the general election. How can women use our voting power to achieve major changes for women? How can we work together to ensure politicians heed our voices? Why are so-called women's issues never seen as mainstream in elections? We'll also look at how women overseas have banded together to press for change. I've written a 100-point women's election agenda, Aotearoa, setting out some policies I think are important. I hope women around Aotearoa will take the agenda, write in their priorities and then speak to politicians and the public about it. At the moment, in New Zealand and around the world, no progress is being made on issues such as sexual violence against women, the gender pay gap and domestic violence. Things are staying the same or even getting worse. We need to find new strategies to make ourselves more effective. Let's use the 2014 election to do that. Now, for some tips on how women overseas have successfully lobbied for change, let's talk to political scientist Dr. Jennifer Curtin of the University of Auckland. Kia ora, Jennifer, welcome to the program.
Kia ora.
What do we know about how New Zealand women vote in general elections?
This is a really interesting topic, I think, and probably doesn't get as much attention here as it should compared to, say, gender gap in voting behaviour in the US. What we know is that a long time ago, political parties and survey people used to think that women all voted the same as their husbands, but in actual fact they didn't. And once they started tracking what women did with their votes, what they found was that women tended to vote more conservatively than their male counterparts, and this was largely because women were very pro-universal welfare state, very pro-welfare policies that supported aged care, women and children and that sort of thing. So they liked what they had provided by the state, say, prior to 1984. But what we start seeing happening, partly because of the women's movement and the changing nature of political parties, is that since the mid-80s, women voters have started to lean more to the left than their male counterparts. So since 1996, for example, Labour from that point on did very well amongst women voters, and this was partly because of Helen Clark's leadership. Women had started to want to see more women in politics, and they thought women politicians from all sides were more likely to do a better job at representing the sorts of interests that women had. So there's been a change over time in terms of the way women use their vote, if you like. Right now, though, what we know from the 2008 and 2011 elections is that that gender gap in voting behaviour has started to close again. And so John Key does appeal to women voters. I suppose what we also know, though, is that this is the era of personality politics, and he's a nice guy and comes across as a nice guy. And I suppose if we were asking women voters to think wisely about using their vote, they might want to go behind the personalities and check out the policies before making up their minds about who they vote for. We also know that women are often, a good proportion of women are what we call swing voters, or they're not necessarily tied to one particular party. And so this is something that women can remember and let their politicians know that they haven't made up their minds yet. In fact, we know that 30% of voters don't make up their minds about who they're going to vote for until the campaign has actually started.
What issues are important to women in elections? You've mentioned universality and state provision. Are those still key issues?
I think social policy is, and in this day and age we can think about that as being about working for families type policies, parental leave, things that help, policies that help women or support women juggling that double burden that they have of wanting to be in the paid labour market, getting good pay for the jobs that they have so they can support their families. So I think families can be seen as a feminist issue. It's not just a women's issue, but nor are families a way of avoiding women's claims. Family policy is still really important. The other thing that's interesting from the surveys is that women are much less likely to support parties like ACT that are much more oriented at rolling back the state, about lowering taxation rates and about cutting benefits. That's much more, appeals much more to male voters. Most of ACT support comes from male voters. So I suppose parties could take an interest in that.
And I think a lot of our political debate is also framed by men, and so in election campaigns the economy and jobs and the Reserve Bank Act settings are considered mainstream important election issues, but domestic violence and rape law reform are never considered key issues for debate in general elections.
No, I think there's two parts to this issue. First, it is the case that women do care about the state of the economy as well, because of that thing we just mentioned about needing to feed their families and so on, and being able to manage the household budget in ways that they can afford to pay their mortgage. The other thing we know is that parties do a lot of focus group work, trying to work out which issues will have the most traction for them at the least cost in any election. And what we know about a lot of women's issues that aren't related to economic matters, so we might call them social, or they might be civil or legal, are often considered moral issues. So we can think about abortion law reform here as well. And what happens, we see parties shying away from those kinds of issues because they get nervous about the term feminism. They get nervous that maybe this will create a wedge between their core voters. This is something that Labour grapples with sometimes much more than the National Party, because Labour's always traditionally been seen as a working man's party, and so when feminist issues come up or women's issues come up that focus on women as a group, they get very worried that somehow their working men's group is going to feel ostracised by a party that was firstly created for them.
How have women overseas mobilised to use their voting power as effectively as possible?
Over time there's been a range of strategies. So in the 70s what we see here, but also overseas, is women who are committed to women's issues go inside the political parties on all sides of the spectrum, and they create women's caucuses, if you like, or women's committees, where they work really hard to create alternative policies, and then they use their influence. And the big thing that is also shown by overseas research and examples is that getting into the hierarchy of the party machines, so becoming presidents or executive secretaries or whatever of party machines, is really important, because that's the pyramid, that hierarchy is where what matters to policy development gets decided. The other thing we know is that there's a lot of work being done by women's groups outside of political parties. For example, Emily's List, which started in the US and it's in Australia and the UK, and it's about targeting getting women candidates to sign up to a pledge that they will support a range of key women's issues like the right to choose, equal pay, strategies to combat domestic violence and so on, and they will then fundraise for those women's campaigns to get them either pre-selected as candidates, and then once they get selected as candidates, to help fund their actual campaign for election, because all the research shows that the more women who are in Parliament across the political spectrum, the more likely women's issues are going to get onto the parliamentary agenda.
And what strategies specifically should women in New Zealand use this year to get our voices heard?
I think there's a range of strategies, both individual but also collective. So I think the work that the Election Women's Watch Women's Agenda is putting out is really rich data, but not all women, because we're a diverse group, will have the same interest in all these issues. So individual women, if they are passionate about an issue and they feel that their local MP is not working on it properly, they should ring their local MP, they should write letters to the editor, they should contact their list MPs, because every electorate has a bunch of them located sort of in the general area. So there's an individual strategy. Individual women's groups can have a coordinated or a collective strategy around sort of creating a gender audit out of a big campaign document for women, something that's a 1 or 2 pager, because we know politicians are really busy and they only want one page to read on a flight somewhere. And so if we can, like target particular issues and hammer them home. And the other thing I would say is to really start a PR campaign in the period that overlaps with the election campaign, because as I said, 30% of voters at that point still haven't made up their mind, and they're going to be looking to a range of media for cues on what they should or who they should be looking to vote for.
And how important do you think it is for women to act collectively?
I think this is important in the sense of showing politicians that the women's vote can be thought of as a bloc. But we do need to be careful about overshadowing the diversity that is women's vote. And so that's why I would say that different women's groups may want to pick up different issues, but just remember that the attention span of those that they're targeting, including the media, is very short. And so one or two issues at a time with solid sound bites is more likely to gain traction than something that's really huge.
Thanks very much, Jennifer.
You're welcome.
Now it's time for this week's Womenpower Fail and Womenpower Win. Women were banned from working as serving staff at the Nuclear Security Summit lunch in The Hague. The catering company director said that if 20 gentlemen are serving and 3 platinum blonde ladies, then that spoils the image. The personnel need to act in as reserved a manner as possible, and you can't achieve that by adding a couple of conspicuous pretty ladies to the mix. The man's original idea was to have all women servers in skimpy dresses, but that was rejected by the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The Womenpower win this week goes to the incredibly courageous members of Russian feminist punk rock protest group Pussy Riot. Despite lengthy prison terms for earlier protests, they remain committed to their activism. They were attacked with whips and pepper spray by Cossack militia as they protested peacefully at Sochi. In recent weeks, they've been left with chemical burns and head injuries after being attacked by groups of masked men. Now it's time to welcome Dr. Selina Tusitala-Marsh to talk about how poetry has given Pacifica women a voice. Talofa Selina, welcome to the program.
Talofa lava, Catriona. Thanks for having me here.
Oh, it's great to have you, a real privilege. Tell us about your name, will you?
I often get asked about whether Tusitala is my real name, and it is. I got it from my Tuvaluan grandfather. It means teller of tales, and some of the family gossip relate that name that grandfather had to when he worked on the plantation of Robert Louis Stevenson.
That's whose name was.
The canonical Scottish author who lived his last years in Samoa, and apparently grandfather worked on the plantation in some way, and because Samoans didn't have surnames, they often took on the surname of their employer or someone they admired, and Robert Louis Stevenson was given the name Tusitala by Samoan chiefs. So it is a legacy that I've kind of grown into, and back in '94 I made a poem before my first international conference to kind of clarify what I was doing in the institution and what the kind of work that I wanted to do. Do you want to hear it?
Yes.
Okay, so
Absolutely.
it goes. So Tusi means to write, Tala means to tell. Tusitala, teller of tales that I never heard till yesterday, born away for another life. Today, the tale I tell is theirs and yours, a way of seeking some more of more of my sacred centre. Today the tale I tell will book its way through tongued histories, sanctioned mysteries, spaces of silence, timeless lives. Tala Tusi, tell the book, word the spirit of Brown, in theory and creativity we make our sound renown.
Amazing, thank you. Tell us about the Pacifica women poets that you did your thesis about.
Yeah, well, I covered 5 Pacific women poets from around, from Hawaii, Vanuatu, the Solomon Islands, Tonga and Samoa. And they were considered, well, I discovered that they were the first 5 Pacific foremothers of poetry written and published in English. But I had not come across them during my whole undergraduate years doing English literature, nor in my master's years. You know, it was just at the very end of my master's when I discovered these formidable women, and I thought, we have our own literary genealogy and work needs to be done in uncovering that.
Mm. And how did those women give a voice to women and children?
Oh, their poetry was a vehicle to, for emancipation, both in terms of a voice answering back to the empire. They were former empires, former British colonies. In the case of Hawaii, still a colony of the United States. So poetry was used to answer back and assert an indigenous reality there, but also in terms of patriarchy and the experiencing of sexist behaviour as women, trying to always kind of cross over boundaries and blow out stereotypes. So there was a double jeopardy that I recognised across the board, that each woman poet worked on both race and gender in terms of wanting to free up not just themselves but the entire communities for which they spoke.
Mm-hmm. And how can poetry be used to affect political change?
That's a really good question. You know, I currently am doing some work for Best Leadership Academy and Charitable Foundation. The CEO is Beatrice Faumuina, and in that program I work with Pacific leaders, and the whole point of me being there is to clarify their vision and enable them to articulate their vision in a way that most people can access, and for me that's through a poem. So my poem that I performed for you earlier, Tusitala, that stayed with me for over a decade, and in those moments where I need to be reminded of my actual purpose and my passion, that comes to my tongue and I recite it. So it's like in the power of articulation, but it has reached many different kinds of audiences, and so the work I do with those leaders is that I help them compose their own poem, and the poem is often very political and it's very personal as well, but it always conveys a story that other people can relate to, and so I think ultimately poetry helps connect people, you know, from very disparate backgrounds to a common cause.
Pacific women's voices are almost completely ignored in our mainstream public debate, politics, media. How can that be changed? You obviously use poetry as a vehicle for that.
Absolutely. You know, I get numerous requests to come and speak and perform to all different kinds of communities and organisations, and people are drawn to the simplicity, the ease and the simultaneous complexity that a poem conveys or has, you know, and it's, I guess it's a return to our ancient oral traditions when you're able to articulate in simplicity in a way that people kind of become open to that message. And I think Pacific women are quite gifted in that they just need a bit of chutzpah or a bit of courage to claim that space publicly and to make that space their own. Alice Walker has a poem, one of my favourite poems, and Alice Walker's coming in May for the Auckland Readers and Writers Festival, and I get to interview her. But her poem starts off, "Be nobody's darling, be an outcast. Take the contradictions of your life and wrap around you as a shawl to parry the stones to keep you warm." And I was raised as a good Samoan daughter where, you know, you're raised to be a darling, and actually to claim that space of rebellion and subversion and be nobody's darling in order to serve you know, your community is exactly what I've had to do, what many Pacific women leaders have had to do, and I think that that's just kind of an ongoing act of reclaiming.
Tell us a bit about your first collection, Fast Talking PI.
Yeah, I was amazed at the success of it because people could relate, and it's a chant about identity in the here and now. And you know, I'm a voice from the Pacific diaspora, so it was claiming exactly who I am, the multiple identities, but also not just kind of for Pacific Island communities. I've had people who are Irish and Scottish come up and say, that's us, we love that. So yeah, it kind of came out at a time where it just resonated throughout a community, and it's actually a perfect pragmatic tool, because that was the poem I'd go into schools and communities and get other people to fill in the gaps for their identity. So from Fast Talking PI, I worked with a group of Somali refugee youth, and they came up with a poem called Fast Talking African Somalis, and we injected their realities and their soundscapes into that poem, and it exhibited at Te Papa for 3 years.
Wow. And what about your most recent collection, Dark Sparring?
Dark Sparring, I love that. So Dark Sparring looks at the ability to embody our grief and our mourning, and it kind of draws connections between a Tuvalu dance that was performed at my mother's funeral and Muay Thai kickboxing, which I took up soon after Mum passed away, just to deal with this grief, you know. And I wasn't born in Samoa, I wasn't raised in Samoa, so I didn't have the access to the performative culture of dance, and I had to learn to move differently, and Muay Thai gave me that ability to move. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Selena.
Thanks so much, Catriona.
Now it's time for News of the Week. Meetings are being held in Auckland to discuss what action needs to be taken in the wake of the Roastbusters revelations. Groups are talking about how to push for real change. Check the websites of the Auckland Women's Centre and Rape Prevention Education for Kātu Māori. Louise Nicholas, Dr Tracy McIntosh and I will speak about women as stakeholders in election 2014 at an event in Auckland on 11 April. Look on Facebook for apple tennies and appetisers. If you haven't seen French actress Eleanor Poirier's movie Majorité Opprimée, check it out. She made it in 2010, but it's only recently exploded on YouTube. The film makes its point by reversing common male and female roles, depicting men as the victims of both casual and aggressive sexism and sexual assault. Dr Gillian Greer has been named as one of the 100 most inspiring people who have delivered for women and girls. Other recipients include Hillary Clinton, Oprah Winfrey and Melinda Gates. A draft law in Afghanistan that would limit testimony in domestic violence cases is drawing condemnation, with activists warning that it's part of a broader trend to roll back women's rights. The new law would prevent relatives of alleged abusers from testifying against them. This would, for example, prevent a woman from testifying that her uncle raped her. Now it's time for the 5 action points. Women need to work together across a range of issues to maximise our impact. Lobby your local MP, the Minister of Women's Affairs and party Women's Affairs spokespersons to close the gender pay gap, reduce domestic violence and reform rape laws. Make sure politicians know they won't get your vote unless they prioritise policies of importance to women. Support the Best Leadership Academy and Charitable Foundation. Help give Pacifica women a voice in our Pākehā male-dominated society. That's our program for this week. Join us next week when we'll look at how low wages impact on Pacifica women's families. We'll also talk to the Equal Employment Opportunities Commissioner, Dr. Jackie Blue, who says women need to be pushier about seeking equality. Thanks for watching. Ka kite anō.